The 86 children who disappeared from Sacred Heart Orphanage and were never seen again beneath the black iron gates of Sacred Heart Orphanage. The sound of children's voices once seemed to promise hope. In the crisp air of Vienna's winter, their laughter spilled into the streets like fragile proof that the city's forgotten little ones had found shelter. To passers-by, the sight of the stone building with its tall windows and carefully kept garden stood as a monument to charity. Its name carried the blessing of Archduchess Sophie of Austria, who praised the institution as proof of moral progress, a light in an age where poverty still swallowed families whole. Yet to those who lived within, the walls felt less like guardianship and more like a mouth that swallowed without letting go. It was here that silence became more powerful than joy, creeping through the halls in a way that gnawed at the edges of memory. Children admitted to the orphanage were catalogued with careful pen strokes in ledgers, their lives reduced to neat ink lines and numbers. But as the months turned, those same names would disappear as though they had never existed at all. One day there would be a boy called Lucas with hair like straw and a crooked smile playing in the yard. The next week, when his absence was noticed, the record showed he had never been admitted. Those who dared whisper asked where Lucas had gone, but others shook their heads, too afraid to answer, as if speaking the truth aloud would invite a punishment worse than loss. The facade of kindness was perfected for visitors. When nobles or clerics came to inspect the orphanage, they saw children dressed in clean linen, rehearsed in polite gestures, lined up like proof of a holy mission fulfilled. Dr. Johann Schreber, the director, would bow with a calm smile, his hands folded in a gesture of humility. His reputation as a reformer, a man who cared for the bodies and minds of abandoned children, kept questions from rising too high. But when the doors closed again and the nobles' carriages rattled back toward the city, the quiet settled heavy over the rooms and the children's laughter dulled into something brittle, something that could snap at any moment. Some of the orphans began to notice things that did not make sense. At night, doors were locked from the outside and certain children were led away, never to be seen in the dormitories again. A pale girl whispered that she heard crying through the chapel floorboards. Another boy swore he had seen a long, narrow cart wheeled into the cellar, covered with a white cloth that sagged with weight. These were brushed off as bad dreams, yet the fear in their eyes betrayed the truth. They knew something lived beneath the orphanage, something that took children not because of sickness or accident, but because it wanted to. Dr. Schreber's shadow lingered longer than anyone else's. He walked the halls at night with a lamp, pausing at each bed, watching their breathing with an attention that felt more like study than care. To the staff, he spoke of discipline and salvation, of shaping broken children into pure souls fit for heaven. To the children, his presence was wordless, heavy, impossible to escape. It was said that the longer his gaze stayed on a child, the sooner that child would vanish. By the winter of 1841, the laughter at Sacred Heart grew thin, as if each echo was being swallowed into the walls themselves. Outsiders continued to see only a beacon of charity. But within the gates, the orphans had begun to understand what no one would dare say aloud, that the orphanage did not save them. It consumed them one by one, leaving behind only silence where their voices once lived. Dr. Johann Schreber carried himself like a man carved from calm stone, never raising his voice, never letting his movements appear rushed. To Vienna's noble circles, he was the perfect image of benevolence, a physician who had stepped down from the halls of science to serve the abandoned, who spoke of compassion for the voiceless, and who framed his work as both medical duty and divine service. The Archduchess herself had praised him for his reforms, noting that under his guidance the children of Sacred Heart Orphanage looked healthier, cleaner, more disciplined than in any other institution. He stood at her side during visits, bowing modestly, his smile gentle enough to disarm even the most suspicious. But when the carriages rolled away and the iron gates clanged shut behind them, the nature of his smile revealed itself. It was not warmth, it was possession. Schreber's fascination with the children was cloaked in language that no one dared challenge. He measured their breath with his hands pressed lightly against their chests, timing each rise and fall as though charting life itself. He counted their bones, prodding spines and rib cages, noting which ones curved too far or grew unevenly. He watched how silence sat in their throats, how long they could hold it before gasping for air, as if he was searching for some hidden code inside the fragility of youth. To the orphans, these examinations felt more like being dissected alive, though Schreber always ended them with a smile, whispering that they were blessed to be made new under his care. That smile became a mark of dread, a signal that once his attention fell upon a child, their days within the dormitory were numbered. His cruelty was not wild or impulsive. It was methodical, shaped like a science experiment repeated again and again. The children who vanished were not merely taken, they were selected. Schreber recorded their names in his private journals, writing not of their laughter or their needs, but of their measurements, their endurance, their weaknesses. To him they were living instruments waiting to be tuned, adjusted, perfected. His obsession bled into rituals of control. At night he walked the dormitories with a lamp, his steps slow and deliberate, stopping at each bed to listen to breathing patterns as if each inhale and exhale held a secret rhythm that only he could hear. Some nights he stood longer beside certain children, watching until they stirred in unease. By morning, those were the children who would be called away for examinations, never to return to the rows of straw beds. The staff noticed the disappearances, though none dared confront him. Schreber held power beyond the orphanage. He was tied to imperial courts, to noble patrons who saw him as a necessary guardian of Vienna's most vulnerable. His word carried weight, and his methods, however unsettling, were accepted as innovations in child welfare. He cloaked each cruelty in rationality, explaining that silence in children was proof of discipline, that physical endurance was a sign of moral purity, that suffering itself was a step toward salvation. His language was smooth, so convincing that even those who doubted him hesitated, unwilling to risk their positions by opposing a man with both medical authority and noble favor. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind ticked with hunger. Schreber did not see children as beings to be nurtured, but as vessels through which he could study life's fragility. Vessels he could break apart and rearrange under the guise of reform. He lingered on their bodies not with desire but with cold calculation, as though each small frame were a puzzle waiting to be solved. When a child's breathing faltered, when their bones betrayed their weakness, he recorded it not with sorrow but with interest, marking them as a subject for his next experiment. Every vanished child was proof to him that he was edging closer to a secret only he could grasp, a truth hidden in the delicate line between life and silence. By 1842, the orphanage no longer felt like a place of shelter but a stage upon which Schreiber performed his hidden rituals of control. Each smile he gave in the daylight deepened the fear in the children who remained, for they had begun to understand that their safety was not real. It was only a pause, a waiting game until his eyes landed on them with that same soft calculation. And once chosen, there would be no escape, only the slow unraveling of their small, fragile lives beneath the hands of the man Vienna still called a savior. Beneath the orphanage, where the polished halls ended and the stone turned damp and uneven, narrow passages branched into places no visitor had ever seen. These corridors, carved in secret and never written on any blueprint, led to chambers where light itself seemed afraid to linger. The air smelled of lime and iron, heavy with the weight of years of hidden use. It was here that Dr. Johann Schreiber revealed the truth of his work, a truth too calculated to be called madness and too deliberate to be mistaken for mercy. The children who descended into these rooms never returned. Their absence explained away in ledgers as illnesses, transfers, or mistakes in record-keeping. But the walls beneath Sacred Heart remembered them, for their cries had been etched into the stone until silence was the only sound that remained. Each chamber was crafted with intention. One room was shaped like a cistern, its curved ceiling designed to catch and magnify even the faintest sound. When Schreiber placed a child inside and sealed the door, their sobs spun in endless echoes, returning louder, fuller, until their own voices overwhelmed them. A whimper became a scream became a storm, and soon they no longer knew if the cries belonged to themselves or to something in the walls. Some clawed at their throats to silence the sound, while others collapsed in terror, their voices shattering like glass until nothing came out at all. Schreiber recorded the moments when speech failed, fascinated by how quickly fear could unravel the human will. For him, these were not deaths of chance, but carefully orchestrated collapses, measured in heartbeats and written in his journals like sacred equations. In another chamber, Schreiber practiced what he called holy drowning. A child would be lowered into a stone basin filled with water, their small frame thrashing as panic overtook them. Just before life slipped away, he pulled them out and pressed air back into their lungs, reviving them in a rush of coughing and desperate gasps. He would whisper that they had been given mercy, that heaven itself had returned them to the world, before plunging them back beneath the surface. The cycle repeated again and again, each revival a cruel mockery of salvation. Some began to believe they had died and returned more than once, their minds breaking under the weight of false resurrection. Others begged to be allowed to remain beneath the water, to let the final silence take them instead of the endless torment of Schreiber's hands. When death finally arrived, it was not sudden but weary, a surrender carved from repeated betrayals of hope. Schreiber's methods were more than cruelty. They were rituals designed to merge suffering with meaning. He blended the language of Catholic penance with the cold detachment of medical experimentation. Children were told their agony was purification, that each scream or convulsion was a step closer to grace. He documented their final moments with precision, noting how long it took for breath to fade, how eyes shifted when faith fractured, how silence claimed the body at last. These details fed his obsession, convincing him that pain revealed truths no scripture could. The chambers became his laboratories of revelation, places where the boundaries between science and faith dissolved into something darker, something only he could interpret. For the children trapped in these rooms, hope decayed quickly. At first they cried for the sisters, for their friends, for anyone who might hear them through the walls. But as hours stretched into days, the echo of their own voices became unbearable. Their minds bent inward, consumed by fear that no one else remained alive above them. Some prayed, their words bouncing back distorted and hollow, as though God himself had twisted their pleas into mockery. Others grew quiet, their silence not from peace but from the certainty that nothing waited beyond the chamber door but another round of Schreber's examinations. Each death left behind no body for the others to mourn. Schreber disposed of them in silence, his methods as meticulous as his killings. The living never saw what became of their companions, only knew that once taken to the underground they vanished. That absence grew heavier than grief. The children upstairs learned not to speak the missing names, for to remember too loudly was to draw Schreber's attention, and his attention was a death sentence. The orphanage itself grew more hollow with each loss. The laughter that once filled the halls reduced to whispers, then to nothing at all. And through it all, Schreber smiled. To those above, it was the smile of a man devoted to the care of the forgotten. But in the chambers below, it was the smile of one who believed he had found a doorway into mysteries of life and death no one else dared to seek. Each body, each broken voice, each silenced child was a note in the song only he could hear. And still he was not finished. The rooms without windows were only the beginning of his harvest. Word count 800. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, The Angels' Choir, 800 Words, where Schreber's obsession with reshaping voices through mutilation and ritual takes center stage? Dr. Johann Schreber's obsession with silence soon turned toward its opposite. If the chambers beneath the orphanage had taught him the limits of endurance, then the choir became his experiment in reshaping what remained. He began to see the children's voices not as fragile gifts, but as instruments that could be bent, cut, and rebuilt into something beyond human. In his journals, he wrote that the human throat was like an organ pipe, flawed by nature but perfectible by man. And so he set about crafting his choir, believing that through their voices he could summon something pure enough to pass as angelic, something so haunting that even the nobility would call it divine. The training began with control. Children were forced to sing for hours until their voices cracked, their throats raw with blood. When one could no longer hold pitch, Schreber would examine their throat with a scalpel, marking the muscles that trembled too easily. Some he cut deliberately, creating scars that tightened the cords and raised the pitch into shrill, unnatural tones. Others he burned with heated rods, reshaping the flesh so that the voice would falter into ghostly whispers. Those who survived these procedures became part of his choir, Those who did not were recorded only as failures in his meticulous ledgers, their bodies carried away in silence. For the children, singing became terror. They knew that a wrong note was not simply a mistake, but a sentence. If a voice wavered too often, Schreiber would drag them to the isolation boxes, small wooden coffins fitted with metal rods and tuning forks pressed against their bones. The forks were struck repeatedly, sending vibrations through their skulls and ribs until their bodies shook violently. Schreiber believed this forced resonance would reshape the very core of the voice, fusing flesh with sound. Some children emerged unable to speak at all, their vocal cords shredded into silence. These were the failed voices, and the orphanage knew what became of them. They were taken away at night, their absence explained with the same hollow words as always. Illness, transfer, God's will. And yet the survivors sang. Their voices carried a sound that unsettled even those who claimed to be moved. High notes rang sharp, almost piercing, as though pulled from throats not meant to hold them. Low tones droned with an unnatural tremor, vibrating the air in ways that stirred unease in the stomach. Schreiber watched with pride, convinced he had found proof of his theory. That pain could carve beauty, that the breaking of a body could summon a voice closer to heaven. The children wept when the rehearsals ended, but in the presence of visitors they stood rigid, their voices blending into something that was both haunting and inhuman. When nobles came to hear the choir, they remarked on the unearthly harmony. Some claimed the sound moved them to tears, others whispered that it felt like a glimpse of the divine. None asked why the children stood so stiffly, or why their eyes seemed so hollow, or why their throats bore scars hidden beneath high collars. They clapped politely, praised Schreiber for his devotion, and left believing they had witnessed a miracle. Behind the iron gates, they spoke of charity and reform, while inside the walls the children knew that each note sung had been purchased with another's suffering. For Schreiber, the choir was not music. It was proof of his dominion over flesh, proof that he could take fragile lives and sculpt them into instruments of his own design. Every death, every scar, every silence became part of the symphony he alone could hear. The angels' choir sang not of heaven, but of torment shaped into beauty, a beauty so terrible that once it entered the ears of those who heard it, it could never be forgotten. Schreiber's obsession did not end with the voice. Once he believed he had proven that the throat could be bent into angelic harmony through pain. His attention turned to the body itself. He spoke of discipline as a divine law, of the flesh as clay that must be reshaped through suffering, and he claimed that true purity came not from innocence, but from endurance. He borrowed freely from the pages of medical journals that spoke of circulation, of nerves, of physical thresholds, and he wove them together with the darker remnants of medieval mortification practices that the church had long buried in silence. What emerged was not punishment in the ordinary sense, but ritualized torture masquerading as penance. Each act carried out with the cold precision of a surgeon and the reverence of a priest. The most feared of these devices was what Schreiber called the devotional frame. To an outsider, it might have looked like a simple wooden rack, but to the children it was a sentence stretched out over endless hours. They were bound on their knees, their backs forced rigid against angled beams, their arms locked in positions of supplication. Once fastened, they could not move. not even to shift the weight in their aching joints. Above their heads, a small copper funnel dripped water in slow, steady drops onto their skulls. At first it was only an irritation, but with each hour the rhythm bored into them, bruising the skin, then piercing deeper until tiny wounds formed. The water seeped into those cuts, hollowing grooves into the bone itself, as if time were engraving obedience into their very heads. Schreiber recorded how long it took for the body to give way. 3 days for some, 5 for others, before they collapsed into unconsciousness, their minds undone by the torture of endless kneeling, endless dripping, endless prayers that brought no relief. For others, Schreiber favored a more direct form of sacrifice. He spoke of blood as both medicine and sacrament, the river of life that carried the truth of the soul. He would open the veins of his chosen victims, never enough to kill quickly, but enough to let them drain slowly into silver chalices he had commissioned from Viennese craftsmen. Each cup was etched with religious symbols as though sanctifying the cruelty. He measured every ounce with the same care a chemist might measure reagents, fascinated by how much a child could lose before life began to slip away. When the body trembled with weakness, when lips grew pale and eyes dimmed, he sometimes returned a portion of the blood, forcing them to drink from the chalice as though they were consuming a holy wine made of themselves. Some retched and choked, others swallowed in confusion, their faith fractured by the mockery. None survived the ritual for long. Their deaths were slow, drawn out over hours of dizziness and collapse, each one catalogued in Schreiber's notes as a study in the limits of the flesh. These acts were not performed in secrecy alone. To the staff and visiting clerics, Schreiber cloaked them in the language of purification. He declared that the children were paying penance for the sins of the world, that their endurance lifted them closer to heaven. The more their bodies broke, the more proof he claimed of their spiritual triumph. No one dared oppose him, for his manner was calm, his explanations learned, and his position too powerful to question. Even those who suspected cruelty convinced themselves it was only discipline taken to extremes. The truth was too dreadful to acknowledge, that Schreiber was not saving souls but consuming them in rituals of his own design. The children left alive were marked by these horrors in ways that could never heal. They learned to walk in silence, to bow their heads at the faintest sound of footsteps, to bury their own pain before it drew attention. They had seen what became of those chosen for the frame, what became of those drained into silver cups. Each scarred body, each empty bed in the dormitory was a reminder that their own turn would come. Hope had no place within Sacred Heart now, only endurance, only the quiet calculation of how long they might remain unseen. For Schreiber, each death was not an ending but a revelation. The grooves in the skulls left by dripping water, the pale hollows of drained children, the shattered eyes of those who drank their own blood. These were his scriptures, each one proof that he was reaching into mysteries no priest or physician had dared before. He wrote of the rituals as if they were steps in a grand design, a design only he was chosen to complete. In his mind, he was no murderer. He was the architect of purity, carving divinity out of suffering, building a cathedral of pain beneath the stone foundations of the orphanage. And still he was not satisfied. There were more truths to uncover, more bodies to reshape, more silence to bind into song. At night the orphanage grew heavier than stone, its silence broken not by laughter or prayer, but by sounds that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The children who remained alive began to whisper in their beds, afraid to let their voices carry, afraid even of their own breath. They said they heard tapping in the corridors, faint scratching that rose from beneath the floors, soft cries that trembled behind plaster and brick. At first the older ones told themselves it was only the settling of wood, the echo of rats gnawing, but soon they could no longer deny the human weight of it. The whispers were not imagination. The walls of Sacred Heart were alive with voices that did not belong to the living. Dr. Johann Schreber had refined his cruelty into something the building itself could hold. The underground chambers had satisfied him only for a time. Now he believed the very structure of the orphanage could be used as an instrument of torment, that the bones of the house could become one with the bones of the children. He began by carving narrow recesses into the stone foundations, spaces no larger than a coffin but not fully sealed. Into these he slid his chosen victims, pressing their small bodies into darkness where no light could reach. Before closing the stone, he left a single pipe that ran to the open air, just wide enough to carry breath and the faintest threads of sound. The child entombed inside could live for days, weeks even, their voices carrying in muffled fragments through the walls. They were alive, but unreachable, turned into hidden organs of the house itself. At first, the other children thought the cries were ghosts, the spirits of those already lost. But Schreber knew better. He listened with fascination as the voices weakened over time, the early screams giving way to hoarse pleas, the pleas breaking into dry whispers until finally there was only the faint rasp of breath before silence. He measured the progression carefully, counting how many days before hunger twisted into delirium, how long before thirst burned away speech, how many times the trapped ones beat their fists against stone before their hands shattered. Each detail went into his journals as though he were documenting experiments in acoustics rather than acts of burial. The building became his laboratory, every wall a potential echo chamber for dying voices. For the children who still roamed the dormitories, the psychological toll was unbearable. They tried to sleep but woke with their hearts racing, convinced the walls were breathing with them. Some pressed their ears against the stone, unable to stop themselves from listening, only to hear the faint begging of someone they once knew, a friend, a sibling, now reduced to a voice behind brick. To turn away was worse, for then the guilt took hold, that they had heard and done nothing, that they would hear the voice fade to nothing while they remained alive. Soon the survivors spoke less and less, afraid of their own voices, as if the walls might claim them next. Visitors to Sacred Heart remarked on the strange acoustics, noting how the chapel seemed to carry a hum that lingered even after prayers ended, how the corridors carried faint echoes as though the building had been hollowed in unseen places. They praised Schreber for the discipline of his children, for the eerie stillness of the orphanage, unaware that the harmony they admired was built on the suffering of those still walled alive. When nobles heard a stray cry hidden under the choir's song, Schreber explained it as the natural resonance of the stone, a blessing of architecture. No one questioned him. No one wanted to believe the truth. that they were listening to the last breaths of children pressed into living graves. Schreiber himself felt a grim satisfaction in walking the halls at night, hearing the soft tapping that only he knew how to interpret. He believed he was binding the orphanage to the children, making the building itself a vessel of their endurance. In his twisted vision, each muffled cry was a prayer, each fading voice a hymn, each silence proof that suffering had been transformed into permanence. The walls were no longer walls to him. They were reliquaries, monuments to his work, each stone hiding not only a body but a secret scripture written in breath and bone. And so the orphanage changed. Its very foundations became instruments of fear, its architecture a trap where no step was free from echoes. For those who remained alive, every sound carried a question. Was it a survivor begging behind the stone, or was it the echo of someone already gone? Schreiber's cruelty no longer required his direct hand. It lived now in the walls themselves, whispering through the nights, feeding dread into every corner of the house. And still, the orphans knew the worst truth of all, that these whispers would not end. Not until the last voice in Sacred Heart was silenced. The day the nobility entered Sacred Heart, the orphanage shed its gloom like a stage, drawing back its curtains. The dormitories were scrubbed, the corridors scented with incense, and the children chosen to be displayed were washed and dressed in white linen. Their pale faces and hollow eyes were mistaken for innocence by visitors who had never seen what it meant to starve in silence. Archduchess Sophie of Austria herself arrived in her carriage, her presence heavy with both piety and authority. With her came a company of clerics and physicians, men who claimed to represent the highest wisdom of faith and science. All of them were led by the steady hand of Dr. Johann Schreiber, who greeted them with the serenity of a saint. He bowed, his smile gentle, his words chosen with care, speaking not of cruelty but of miracles. The demonstrations were held in the chapel, where light from tall windows turned the air pale and sacred. Schreiber had arranged the pews so that the visitors sat as witnesses to his theater of survival. Before them were children who had already endured the worst of his experiments, now forced to endure once more under the guise of proof. A boy was brought forward, his body so thin his skin clung to his bones. Schreiber bound him upright within a frame and announced that he would demonstrate the strength of faith. He deprived the child of air, tightening a device around his chest until his lips turned blue and his eyes rolled back. When collapse seemed final, Schreiber loosened the binds, pressing his mouth against the child's in calculated resuscitation. The boy gasped and trembled, dragged back from the edge of death, and the Archduchess clasped her hands in awe, convinced she had seen divine mercy made flesh. To her it was a miracle, to Schreiber it was a performance, another step in proving that suffering could be manipulated as easily as a heartbeat. Next he showed them the choir. The children stood stiffly, scars hidden beneath their collars, their voices quivering in the air. They sang hymns until their throats cracked, the harmonies so sharp and uncanny that visitors felt tears without knowing why. The Archduchess leaned forward, whispering that the voices must be touched by heaven. None dared wonder why those same children collapsed once the singing ended, their bodies convulsing in pain, their voices broken beyond repair. The applause masked the truth, that each note had been carved from flesh with knives and fire. Schreiber's greatest deception lay in his revival rituals. He filled a basin with water, lowering a girl into its depths. The audience watched as her struggles slowed, as her body went limp beneath the surface. Just as murmurs of alarm began, Schreiber lifted her out, pressing upon her chest, forcing air back into her lungs. She coughed, water streaming down her face, her body shivering as she breathed once more. The visitors gasped, and Archduchess Sophie declared it a sign that God had chosen Schreiber as his instrument. The girl's terror, her pleading eyes went unseen, for all that mattered to the noble audience was the spectacle of death denied. They did not ask how many children had drowned before this one, how many had not been brought back, how many had been discarded into silence once their usefulness ended. Behind the applause there was calculation. The cleric saw in Schreiber's methods a spectacle that could renew faith among the people, proof of providence staged through children who had no voices to resist. The physician saw the experiments as curiosities, fragments of knowledge pulled from flesh too fragile to protect itself. And the nobility, led by Sophie, saw a convenient truth, that if such miracles could be shown at will, the orphanage could stand as both a shield against scandal and a symbol of Austria's moral strength. None wished to expose the cruelty that lay beneath, for each gained something from the silence. In the days that followed, Schreiber's reputation only grew. His calm smile reassured those who doubted. His demonstrations silenced those who questioned. But within the orphanage, the children understood more than anyone. They knew that every miracle shown to the nobles was only possible because others had been sacrificed in secret, their deaths erased to make the survival of one child appear holy. They knew that applause in the chapel meant more would be taken in the night, more voices stolen to perfect the next performance. For Schreiber himself, the presence of the Archduchess confirmed his destiny. In her awe he saw permission, in her praise he saw divine sanction. The systematic killing that followed each demonstration was no longer a burden to him. It was proof that his work was necessary, that every discarded child was part of a design too great for ordinary men to understand. He had turned suffering into theater, death into applause, and cruelty into policy. And the nobility, bound by their own silence, had become his accomplices. The orphanage of Sacred Heart had always been a place of numbers. The ledgers, written in tidy ink and bound in black leather, were said to be the proof of order and salvation. Every child who entered passed into those pages, their names neatly recorded, their ages, their illnesses, their small histories. To visitors, these books represented stability, evidence that each child was accounted for under the careful watch of Dr. Johann Schreiber. But when a Jesuit priest was assigned to review them in the winter of 1847, he discovered a pattern that clung to him like a shadow. He noticed that certain names appeared in one ledger and vanished in the next as though the children had never existed. He walked the dormitories, counting heads, searching for faces that should have been there. They were not. When he asked the staff, they spoke in low voices of transfers, of adoptions, of errors in ink. Yet no letters of adoption were ever produced. No families came forward, and the number of missing grew larger the deeper he searched. The ledgers were not clumsy forgeries. Schreiber's hand was exact, his falsifications so precise that only someone with the patience of faith would dare to find the cracks. Pages had been carefully scraped and rewritten, names erased with a practiced smoothness as if they had never been written at all. The priest realized that this was not sloppy concealment but a ritual of erasure, performed with the same calm as Schreber's examinations. Every vanished child was not only taken from life but scrubbed from memory, stripped of even the trace of their name. Schreber seemed to believe that to truly own the children, it was not enough to kill them. One had to unmake them entirely, to write them out of existence so that their absence could never cry out. But Schreber's cruelty reached further still. The children who remained were not spared the weight of erasure. They were forced to become instruments of it. Schreber began assigning them new names, commanding them to repeat those names until their old ones slipped away. Brothers were separated, sisters torn apart, their bonds deliberately fractured as Schreber instructed them to forget each other's existence. If a child cried out for a missing sibling, they were beaten until they recited that no such sibling had ever been admitted. The youngest, confused and pliant, began to believe the lie. The older ones fought against it until their resistance was ground down by hunger, fear, and endless correction. Slowly their memories warped. They no longer knew if their own names had been real, no longer trusted the faces they thought they remembered. They learned to doubt themselves, to surrender their pasts to Schreber's design. For Schreber, this rewriting of identity was as fascinating as the experiments of flesh. He observed how long it took for memory to fracture, how many repetitions before belief gave way to submission. He forced children to stand before him and recite their false names while he watched their eyes for signs of collapse. Some broke quickly, collapsing into sobs, begging to be told who they were. Others clung stubbornly to their memories, only to be dragged into the chambers where silence would finish what confusion had begun. Schreber wrote that memory was more fragile than bone, that the self could be destroyed without spilling blood, leaving behind a hollow vessel to be remade. The survivors of these manipulations became living ghosts. They drifted through the orphanage with vacant stares, unable to remember who they had once been, unable to mourn the missing because Schreber had carved even the act of remembrance from them. A boy who once had a brother no longer spoke of him. When asked, he claimed with dull certainty that he had always been alone. A girl who once whispered prayers for her sister now sat mute, her eyes hollow, unable to say whether she had ever known anyone by that name. These were not lies. They were confessions forced by a mind that no longer trusted itself. Schreber had turned memory itself into a form of torture, a weapon sharper than knives, erasing children not only from the ledgers but from their own hearts. The Jesuit priest who uncovered the discrepancies grew pale with fear, for he realized that what Schreber had built was not merely a system of killing but a system of forgetting. To expose the truth would be to admit that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children had been consumed and erased, their absence cloaked beneath the perfection of record-keeping. The priest carried his doubts back to Vienna, but when he whispered them to clerical superiors, he was met with uneasy silence. They warned him that the Archduchess herself had praised Schreber's work, that to accuse him would be to accuse the empire of complicity. And so his words died in the air, swallowed by the same silence that had claimed the children. Within the orphanage, Schreber's smile never faltered. He walked the halls with calm precision, a man revered as both physician and saint, while around him the children's identities dissolved into shadows. His cruelty was no longer confined to chambers or devices. It was written in the air they breathed, in the pages of the books that erased them, in the very thoughts they struggled to hold on to. For Schreiber, it was not enough to kill a body. He wanted to kill the idea of a child, to erase the possibility that they had ever lived. And in this, he succeeded one name at a time until memory itself bent to his will. The winter of 1852 brought with it a bitter cold that pressed against the stones of Vienna like a hand intent on freezing the city in place. Inside Sacred Heart Orphanage, the season carried a different kind of chill, one that crept not from nature but from the preparations underway. The nobles of the court, led by Archduchess Sophie, expected a feast, a celebration to crown the year with piety and refinement. And Schreiber, ever the devoted servant, promised them something unlike anything they had witnessed before. The choir of Sacred Heart would sing not as children but as angels carved from suffering. For months he had labored toward this final display, pushing his methods further, stripping the humanity from the voices he controlled until they were no longer voices at all, but instruments that sounded as though they belonged to another world. The rehearsals became executions disguised as practice. Schreiber demanded tones that no child's throat could hold without breaking. To reach them, he employed bellows, machines usually meant to fan flames, repurposed to force air down into fragile lungs. Children strapped to wooden benches convulsed as their chests filled, their cries stretched into shrieks that clawed at the stone walls. When their throats tore under the pressure, when blood spilled with each note, Schreiber watched with clinical precision, recording which bodies yielded the sound he desired before collapsing into silence. Those who could no longer produce were discarded, carried beneath the chapel, and thrown into lime pits where their remains dissolved into the stone foundations. Each death was another step closer to his perfect harmony, and he believed the sacrifice sanctified the sound that would follow. Cold was his next instrument. He plunged children into ice water baths until their lips turned blue, their voices trembling in unnatural pitches when pulled out and forced to sing. The shock of the cold tightened their vocal cords, drawing sounds that bordered on inhuman high notes that rang with eerie sharpness. Some collapsed before they ever sang a full line, their bodies breaking under the strain, their skin cracked and white as they were dragged away. Others endured long enough for Schreiber to note the tones he had sought, the frost-bitten trembling preserved in their voices. But the longer the rehearsals went on, the smaller the choir became, until rows that had once held dozens were cut nearly in half. And still he demanded more. Mechanical devices became his final instruments of control. Iron braces clamped around jaws to force mouths open wider than natural, stretching tendons until they tore. Weighted masks were strapped over faces, forcing posture and sound to align with his design. Children stood locked in place, unable to move, their voices driven out of them by screws, straps, and bolts. Some sang until their throats bled dry, others until their spines snapped beneath the pressure. Schreiber marked their ends without sorrow, believing each death a necessary refinement. Every failed body was nothing more than a discarded note in his score, erased so that the final composition could be pure. For the surviving children, the rehearsals were a descent into madness, They no longer sang out of choice or even fear, but out of desperation to survive one more day. They watched their companions fall beside them, carried away and never returned, and they knew their own time was near. Their voices cracked from exhaustion, but still Schreiber pressed them. Still he demanded sounds that no living throat could sustain. They began to see themselves as already dead, their voices the only pieces left alive, forced to echo long after their bodies failed. In the dormitories, they no longer spoke to each other, no longer remembered names or faces. They were only the choir now, bound together by fear and by the certainty that their voices would be all that remained of them when the feast arrived. When the night of the performance came, the orphanage glowed with candlelight, the chapel filled with nobles dressed in silks and jewels. Archduchess Sophie sat at the center, her eyes fixed on Schreiber with the devotion of a woman convinced she was about to witness heaven itself. The surviving choir filed in, their steps slow, their faces pale, their throats bound with hidden scars. They opened their mouths and sang, and what came forth was a sound so pure and terrible that the audience sat frozen. The notes were flawless, but they did not feel human. They rang sharp and cold, trembling in the air like glass about to shatter. Each harmony threaded with the echoes of the suffering that had birthed it. The nobles wept openly, convinced they had heard angels descend into the chapel. None dared ask why the children swayed as they sang, why their bodies seemed ready to collapse, why their eyes stared blankly forward as though life itself had already left them. The performance lasted only minutes, yet its weight lingered long after. When the final note faded, several children fell where they stood, their voices carried into silence forever. Schreiber did not move to help them. Instead, he bowed as the applause filled the chapel, his calm smile fixed in place. To the audience, he had proven the presence of the divine through the voices of the forgotten. To himself, he had completed his harvest, stripping the orphanage of nearly every life to perfect a sound that could never be reproduced again. The nobles left the feast in awe, speaking of miracles and providence, of the glory of Austria and the sanctity of its reformers. None saw the lime pits beneath the chapel floor where dozens of small bodies dissolved in silence. None understood that the perfection they praised had been forged not by heaven but by a man who had turned suffering into music and death into applause. And in the quiet that followed, as the surviving children were locked once more into their dormitories, they understood the truth more clearly than anyone. They were not angels. They were remnants, voices carved from torment, destined to fade into silence once their usefulness was gone. Schreiber's choir had sung its last, and what lingered in its place was not holiness but horror made unforgettable. Word count, 970. Would you like me to now expand? Chapter 10. Silence after the song, 1,300 words. Where the orphanage abruptly closes, the archives reveal fragments of Schreiber's notes, and the story reflects on legacy, silence, and whether such evil could emerge again. When the winter feast ended and the nobles' carriages rolled away into the frozen streets, the orphanage entered a silence deeper than any it had ever known. The choir had sung its last, its final notes dissolving into air already heavy with death. Within weeks, word spread through Vienna that Sacred Heart had been struck by plague. The gates were closed, the windows shuttered, and no child was ever seen leaving its walls again. Officials accepted the explanation without question, for to look closer was to risk finding the truth. Families who had left their children there received no letters, no remains, not even acknowledgement of their existence. In the official records, the year of 1852 passed quietly, marked only by the unfortunate loss of one charitable institution to disease. In reality, it was the quiet erasure of 86 children whose names would never be spoken again. Inside the orphanage, the final harvest had left little behind. Schreiber walked the halls alone, his shoes echoing against stone that no longer carried the faint cries of the living. He kept his journals close, writing with the same steady hand that had falsified ledgers for years. He spoke of voices harvested for heaven, of suffering refined into purity, of silence perfected into song. To him, the work was complete. There was no need for more children, no need for new experiments. The building itself was his reliquary now, each wall filled with what he had buried there, each stone humming with the faint memory of cries that had long since died out. Whether Schreiber died within those walls or simply vanished into the city, no one recorded. His name slipped from public conversation, erased as deliberately as the children had been. Only the stone remained, locked and sealed, its doors never opened again. Decades later, when new officials reviewed the archives of Austria's forgotten institutions, fragments of Schreiber's notes were discovered. They were not full confessions, but careful scraps, pieces of a mind that never saw himself as a murderer. He wrote of angels drawn from human throats, of bodies offered as vessels for divine resonance, of blood and breath transformed into instruments of purity. One entry spoke of a choir perfected through sacrifice, their voices preserved in heaven though their bodies returned to lime. Another spoke of silence as the highest form of discipline, a silence achieved only through burial alive. The words were chilling not only for their cruelty but for their calmness. They were not the ravings of a madman, but the reasoning of a man who believed his horrors were a higher form of science and faith. The truth could not be hidden forever. As whispers of the discoveries spread, Vienna began to wrestle with what had happened behind the iron gates of Sacred Heart. Memorials were built, small plaques placed where the orphanage once stood, but they spoke only of children lost to sickness, never of the cruelty that had consumed them. Families who suspected the truth were told to let the past remain closed, to accept that the empire had moved forward. Laws were tightened, new oversight placed upon orphanages and institutions, as if bureaucracy could prevent another Sacred Heart from rising again. Yet even in these reforms, Schreiber's name was never spoken aloud. He had been erased with the same precision he had used to erase his victims, his identity buried under layers of silence and respectability. For those who dared to read the fragments, the horror lay not only in what Schreiber had done, but in how easily he had been protected. His work thrived because it wore the mask of virtue, because the Archduchess herself had applauded his miracles, because clerics and physicians had chosen to believe in providence rather than cruelty. The orphans had been consumed not only by his hands, but by the silence of all who stood beside him and looked away. It was not simply one man's evil, but the evil of a system that saw suffering and found it easier to call it divine. Today, nothing remains of Sacred Heart but the whispers of its legacy. The building is gone, its stones scattered, its foundations buried. Yet the weight of what was done there lingers like a shadow over history, a reminder that evil does not always come with violence in the open, but often cloaks itself in charity, in science, in faith. Schreber did not roar or rage. He smiled, calm and convincing, and the world believed him until it was too late. And so the story ends not with answers, but with a question. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could another face, calm and benevolent, stand before us today with the same smile, hiding the same hunger, protected once more by institutions eager to look away? The silence after the song is heavy, but it is ours to break, or to allow to continue until it swallows voices once more.